Okay, welcome to the Hoboken Historical Museum on this nice rainy day. And you're really here for a special treat. Our guest, Bill Miller, has been a friend of the museum since the museum has been a museum. And I would say that takes us back to 1986. Bill has always been our go-to person when we're dealing with the ocean liner history of Hoboken, which goes back to the German days, the North German Lloyd and Hamburg American, and also the subject of today's lecture, Holland America. Bill Miller has written, I'll have to say, decades of books, and has worked with the museum on a few projects, which we're very proud of. I'll mention that if you don't have this title on the waterfront, which of course uses the film title, it's a pretty good visual and literary history of Hoboken's maritime history, American export, Bethlehem Steel, North German Lloyd, and Holland America. And it's a good item to have on your shelf, which we have copies of. And then more recently, Bill, those of you who know Bill, he was a school teacher in Hoboken for many years. And he put together a book with Vincent Cassessa, which is called They Taught Us Well. And we still have a few copies of that left. So if you need to take home a piece of today's lecture, one of these books would probably do it. And so, I could say that Bill has been very, very important to the museum. And when I meet someone who says, oh, Hoboken, very often the connector, no degrees of separation, or maybe 1 degree of separation, is the name Bill Miller. So without further ado, let's give him the warm welcome he deserves, Bill Miller.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know how it happens, but no matter where I go in the world, all roads lead to Hoboken. I was sitting on this steamy day in Costa Rica. We were visiting the ruins, and I was tired of listening to the guide, so I sat down on a bench with only 2 seats under a tree for some shade. And a guy comes over to me, and he says, "Can I sit there?" And I said, "Sure you can." I said, "Where are you from?" He said, "New Jersey." I said, "Oh, I'm from New Jersey." "Where in New Jersey?" I said. He said, "You probably never heard of it." "Where's that?" "Hoboken." I said, "Well, as it so happens, I have heard of Hoboken." Well, he was 2 years behind me in Hoboken High, and there we met in a Costa Rican jungle. Now, how did that happen on a bench with 2 seats? It's just unbelievably incredible. But I'm always so proud of Hoboken and so forth. I've written several books about Holland America Line itself, among the over 100 books that I've already written. And by the way, I'm working on a new book for the museum with Vincent Cassessa. The title is The Smell of Coffee. It's about various memories of Hoboken, ranging from winter storms to going to the movies to Washington Street. Just an odd sort of a mixed vegetables of memories of Hoboken of the 50s and 60s. But of course, the smell of coffee was dominant. We all remember it. Your mother ran home to take in the wash when she smelled the coffee because it meant it was going to rain. It was classic. But Holland America was a part of Hoboken until 1963, when on one March day, it had all been arranged. They moved over to Manhattan. And after over 100 years, 75 years, they'd been in Hoboken at the foot of Fifth Street, which of course is Frank Sinatra Pier Park today. And I remember I lived on 12th and Garden, and I would say it was sort of my backyard, but when you were a kid, going down to Fifth Street was a little bit of a journey. I tended to stay up here toward Bethlehem Steel and Todd Shipyards, which was next door. But going down to the pier, I remember my father was a policeman for many years, and he would take me down there and then sometimes take me on the ships. We didn't have the high security we have today. They just showed a badge and you'd walk up the gangway and you could walk around the ships. Well, when the pier was finished and Holland America moved away, it sat empty for a while. And even one of the old Hoboken ferries, the Binghamton, which later became a restaurant in Edgewater, was moored there before it went up to Edgewater, and so forth. And this last picture that I took in about 1985, they were just getting ready to demolish the Fifth Street Pier, and left was a piece of the old gangway where you would walk across to the ship. Somehow it survived, and that was going to be that was part of the rubble. So you can see Hoboken in the 1930s and so forth, quite looking a little bit different, but it was not as important as New York City waterfront, but it was important in its own right. And some very important ships docked here, especially the Holland America liners. And there you can see after in 1948, the Holland America piers with the New Amsterdam in. Now, as a kid, I remember on Friday mornings, every Friday, one of the Holland America ships left for Holland. So at 11:30, the other kids probably didn't notice, I could hear the whistle sounding 30 minutes before sailing while sitting in my classroom in the old Wallace School on 12th and Willow. And that meant at noon, one of those ships was sailing for Holland. Then there was a sailing on Saturday as well. That would go. So Holland America was part of the sound effects of Hoboken. And in the winter, when their ships went on cruises, on the cold winter nights when there was a stillness in Hoboken, they used to sail at 10 p.m. And so you'd hear that whistle and it would rumble all through Hoboken. One of those big liners was leaving and getting ready to go. They were the perfect set on the waterfront. The big liners, the piers, the people going to Europe. This is before people flew, and sailing by ship was a big event. And in 1954, as you know, they originally chose Brooklyn, but then they said the light wasn't right, so they moved the set to Hoboken for On the Waterfront. And Marlon Brando was often featured, the camera looking over, and you see Holland America ships behind him. But people like Tony LaForgia and myself know that sometimes when they switch the angle back to Eva Marie Saint and then back to Marlon, there's a different ship behind them because they filmed it on different days and then edited the scenes together. So one time you'd have the New Amsterdam, then the Mazdam, then another ship, even a freighter. And one time there was no ship, and then they turned back to Eva, and then they went back and there was a ship there. So it was all part of the editing of Hollywood in those days. But those big liners were all part of that great lifestyle. I just came off in October. I had not worked for Holland America Line in probably 10 years, and the phone rang one day, as phones sometimes do, and they said, it's our 150th anniversary. Would you like to be the guest speaker? We're having a special sailing from Rotterdam to New York on the brand new billion-dollar SS Rotterdam number 7. I said, well, I'll look in my date book and see if I'm free. I can maybe make it. So I did, and I sailed across. And then part 2, they invited me back in April to sail the other way. So we went Fort Lauderdale, New York, over to England, and then to Holland. So I got to meet lots of Dutch people, lots of people who love Holland America Line. And a little anecdote, or 2 little anecdotes, during the voyage, which was great fun, was that I met a lady and she said, oh, I'm so happy to meet you. I'm so thrilled. And I said, well, that's very nice. She said, you're Merv Griffin, aren't you? I said, well, no, I'm not Merv Griffin. But she said, you look wonderful. I said, well, not bad since I've been dead for 25 years. And then I had a little birthday luncheon on the ship, a dinner, and I invited an archbishop who was just retired. And I said, join us, Bishop, come to the dinner. And he blessed me and he said, God, Bill's on the 150th anniversary cruise. May he be around for the 175th. I'll be 100. So I'm already set for the 100th anniversary for the Holland America Line. But there you can see how the Holland America piers were directly across from Manhattan. And why were they in Hoboken? Because the New York City piers were full. And so they had to come to Hoboken like the Germans did. We benefited. It was all perfect and good and fine. And they were part of the cityscape. My father had many special duties down there during guarding the ships and so forth, the Holland America liners. And there you can see the Little League field. These pictures are from 1948 when Hoboken's waterfront was booming with ships, thousands of dock workers. It was all part of the city. And there you can see the Rotterdam, one of the older Rotterdams with those classic 50s cars. Now, my brother George used to be the pitcher in the 1950s on the PAL Little League team. I used to go to all the games. I had no interest in baseball at all. I went there just to look at the ships which were over the field. And so that was why I went. Anyhow, let's go back. There's the sound of the great Holland America whistles, which was steam, and they thundered through the town, and at night they were lit up and so forth. Hoboken today, of course, is very much changed. I took this picture from the World Trade Center across, and you can see it's office buildings, a hotel. I don't know if the Hilton is going through yet. Maybe Bob knows, but they have a W Hotel in Hoboken. I mean, who would have ever guessed that? My father would never believe it. And of course, all the piers are gone now. It's parkland. It is beautiful, and I'm happy for it. But there's not a hint of the old days. It's all quite different. It does, of course, still have the most wonderful view of New York City and the river. You couldn't have a better place. Well, anyway, let's go back to 1873 briefly and Holland America Line's history. The big reason why the company was formed was to carry immigrants to America, because there was this flow of people, some of them very poor, who wanted to come to the United States for a new life. And so this company, small, developed ships that carried 8 passengers in first class and about 400 down in what they called steerage in the bottom of the ship. And so business prospered, and Holland America got a reputation for running very safe, very tidy, but very clean ships. They became known as the spotless fleet. There's the little first-class cabin up top, and these ships eventually expanded in size, but the big business was in immigrants, carrying people. So by 1900, they built their 3 largest ships yet, the Noordam, the Rhindam, and here's a name for you, the Potsdam, and that carried 200 in first class, 300 in second class like business, and 2,000 in the bottom of the ship in steerage. Now, that, as I said, was the big business. And Holland America didn't want to have the newest looking ships or the most modern. They made ships look a little bit, how shall I say, not older, but traditional. They even carried sails way too late just to remind the public, to reassure them that they were a conservative company. Now you can see the steerage dining room on board. Immigrants paid $10 to leave Europe 1900 to come to America. And so Holland America developed this business. Now these people came from farms, from, all sorts of places in Europe. They traveled for miles and miles to get to the ship to sail to America. $10, of course, was a lot of money to those people. We equated that it's probably about $400 in today's money, but to a poor immigrant, that was a lot of money. So Holland America developed a process where they built an immigrant hotel at the dockside in Holland, and the immigrants would arrive, and then they would get them ready for the famous Ellis Island entry. So they would teach them hygiene, they would teach them a little English, and they would sell them straw mattresses, which they would use on the ship because they were always worried about, spreading of disease. Holland America in 1890 bought the pier at Fifth Street, and that was the base. However, the immigrants were not allowed to come directly to Hoboken because all third-class passengers had to be taken off from a barge or a tender in the outer harbor and brought directly to Ellis Island. They did not come directly to Hoboken. There might have been a handful of immigrants that came in second class, but very few. That would have been expensive and lavish to those people. Now, how did the immigrants pick their ship to come to America to spend their $10? Yes, the reputation of Holland America was very good and getting better, but they used to count smokestacks. They felt there was a rumor all over Europe that a ship that had 2 smokestacks on top was safer than a ship that had 1 smokestack. There's no connection between smokestacks and safety. But anyhow, the Holland America, like the other companies, began to add fake dummy smokestacks to their new ships so the immigrants could count them. Now, how did the immigrants count them? They didn't study color brochures before they left their farms or villages. They would go down to the village pub or the post office or the railway station, and they would see these big posters of the liners that went to America. And they began to count the smokestacks in the posters to pick the ship to spend their $10. So with the ship with more smokestacks got more passengers. Now, in addition to that, the immigrants believed, they had heard, totally unscientific, so don't run home and do it, that if you ate raw onions for a month before you left, you wouldn't get seasick. Well, there's no connection between raw onions and seasickness, but they all ate them like mad, hoping they wouldn't get seasick. It took about 2 weeks to cross the Atlantic. Could be pretty rough and pretty treacherous, as you can imagine. And then, as I said, the ships would arrive at about 7 in the morning. And the barge or a ferry would come alongside off Staten Island and take the immigrants over to Ellis Island for that big moment. So you can see first class up top, but what a contrast. And the same ship down below was this. Quite a big difference, as you can imagine. And there's another one of the dining rooms. Some of the companies, by the way, you had to bring your own fork and knife even. That's how simple it was. At its peak in 1907, immigrants were arriving at the rate of 1 million a year. 12,000 a day were coming into New York by ship from all over Europe to settle for religious, economic, and political freedom. They wanted, it was rumored in Europe that in America, if you work hard, the streets are practically paved with gold. You can do well. And indeed, that was very true. 12,000 a day, if you can imagine. They were allowed out on deck, the immigrants, an hour a day for fresh air. And if the weather wasn't good, they couldn't go out. They didn't have any entertainment. They entertained themselves. According to statistics, they were fairly happy. It wasn't horrible, but they did get seasick. Now, the big thing was when they got to Ellis Island and coming off the ship, they had to face the immigration officials, and then they had to face the doctors coming into the U.S. So this could be difficult. Now, the immigration people, they might be in a bad mood that day. Maybe he had a fight with his wife, and he couldn't say the big Russian or Polish or Czech or even Dutch names. So he'd say something else, and the immigrant would change his name right on the spot so that he would not be refused coming in. Then there was the medical examination of coming in, queuing up on that early morning. They could see Manhattan just across the bay where they wanted to settle, or just behind Jersey City and Hoboken up. They might go there, but they weren't in yet. So they had to face the doctors, and they would, if they suspected something, they would mark in chalk on your jacket what they suspected. Because although America wanted to welcome these people, and 98.5% were accepted, 18 million total, they still didn't want disease brought in. So there were two things that could happen. They would detain you on Ellis Island, where there was a hospital, and they could wait to see if something would clear up. Some of them had very swollen eyes. They were crying a lot, whatever, and so forth. Or if you were officially denied, they had to take you back free, Holland America, as did the other companies. So what a lonely voyage that must have been, to go back in steerage down below with no other people, because they didn't use that except for a little bit of cargo. Nobody was emigrating to Europe. They were all coming this way. So you could come back and try again in a year or two and so forth. So there you can see doctors with hooks under eyes, poking into ears, but it had to be done. It was part of the process. I did the database for Ellis Island of 820 ships that were listed. There's even more, but there's no records left of it all. Some of the ships were so small, they were like a dinner cruise boat, but yet they crossed the Atlantic, but people had to get here. And every year they used to have the Heritage Awards, and they would invite me. And in the first year they had it, which was, I think, 2001, they were honoring at that particular occasion on Ellis Island, right in the Great Hall, the most famous living immigrant at that time. He couldn't make it. His 72-year-old son came to accept the award. It was Bob Hope, who was 98 at the time. He came in steerage through Ellis Island, and he certainly made a contribution to the United States, no question. Holland America then developed a plan to build bigger and nicer and more luxurious ships, which is the evolution that all companies. So the ROTTERDAM of 1909, seen here in Hoboken, had the first glassed enclosed promenade deck where you would be protected from the harsh weather. In World War I, Holland America carried soldiers leaving from Hoboken to go fight in the trenches of Europe, and then brought home some of the soldiers dead in 1918, 1919, when the war ended. By the 1920s, Holland America decided on some newer ships, but nothing too big. They were always conservative and cautious and moderate, which kept them successful. So they built the Veendam and the Volendam, lovely ships. Now here's some ships. Holland America also carried immigrants down to Mexico and to New Orleans. Now that little ship didn't need 2 smokestacks, the little Edam. but the second was a dummy. Why? So the immigrants could count the stacks and go on it. By the 1920s, coal was put out on ships and oil came in. And number two was immigration quotas started in 1924. So that flow of 1 million a year dropped down to only 100,000 people. So Holland America, like all the companies, had to go out, get some paint and some fabric and dress up steerage and call it tourist class for people on a budget, students and school teachers and secretaries who were going to Europe without a lot of money. And there's the Holland America piers at that time. You can see the Veendam is in the dock. Holland America became well known for their posters, their advertising posters, which is amazing when you think about it. They were given away free. By 1929, they built their best ship yet. Holland America tend to reuse the names, and you might get confused. Well, Bill, how many Statendams and Rotterdams were there? Well, there were 7 Rotterdams. There were 4 Statendams. They liked using the same name over and over again. And so forth. But this was the new Statendam of 1929, and it was the beginning of a new style. Now, there's one of their great posters. This was done by a French artist. Now, that was free, given to you without any cost in those days. Today, that poster sells for $10,000 because it's collectible and it's considered not just shipping history, it's considered art history because it's style. And this poster was done by a French artist called Cassandra, which is considered one of the finest posters of the 1930s, and it was of Holland America Line. You can see the design of the ship was designed to look like Holland, so that when you stepped aboard in Hoboken, you almost thought you were already in Holland. The baronial style of woods, paintings, beautiful carpeting. You can see the dark woods, the smell of coffee and tobacco. They even had working fireplaces on the ship. It was quite something. And this beautiful smoking room, that was the title of a lounge on a ship, a smoking room, quite incredible. Well, by the 1930s, the Depression set in and Holland America was in trouble. Not enough people were sailing to Europe. 1 million people went to Europe in 1930, only 500,000 5 years later. So Holland America had to think of a way to survive. And so they developed an idea to run cruises, cheap cruises for American people who could still afford a few dollars to go on a little voyage. Now, we had prohibition at the time in America. You couldn't drink. So in 1931, Holland America developed an idea that they'd take their ships and they'd sail on a one-night cruise to nowhere. $10. When the ship went out past the 3-mile limit, they could open up the bars and Americans could drink legally and hopefully be sober the next morning and walk ashore at Fifth Street. So those booze cruises saved Holland America Line. So cruising, a trip on a ship, is like chocolate. You have one, you want more. So then the people took a 2-night cruise, 3 nights up to Halifax, Nova Scotia, 5 nights to Bermuda, 7 nights to Havana. So in the 30s, Holland America developed this cruise business as their secondary business, which saved them from financial failure. And you can see life was festive. People got to go on one of these beautiful big liners. They never thought they would sail, and it was all great, great fun. And plus, it provided escape from the tough times of the 1930s. You had a few days where there was a theory that you'd breathe in the salt air and you'd calm down. You'd forget the worries that you had about your business. Holland America carried royalty, movie stars, all sorts of people on the trips to Europe. By 1938, they built their biggest and best ship yet, the New Amsterdam. In fact, in Holland, the workers took a 50% pay cut at the shipyard just to build a ship because they wanted Holland to survive the Depression and succeed. She was one of the most beautiful ships ever built. The main salon was 2 decks high with a sculpted ceiling. The dining room, the ceiling was done in Moroccan leather with Murano chandeliers. Live music every night at dinner. There were 8 courses at supper every night. You sat for 3 hours and the caviar was served in big bowls. And they had live music from the balcony. You can see these pictures, those beautiful Murano chandeliers that were on board the ship. And all the artwork was themed and done in real woods. You can't have real woods on ships anymore because it's not fireproof. But that was all done in sort of 50 different kinds of wood on board, and a model of the little Henry Hudson ship and so forth. And you see they were glamorous times sailing to Europe on the New Amsterdam, and those wonderful big first-class cabins, which had sitting rooms, and they had a big bathroom and a tub the size of Minnesota with 4 taps, hot and cold, fresh, hot and cold salt water. Did I hit the wrong button? I went backwards, I think. The ship even had a shopping arcade, which in 1938 was so unique, where you could sit and try out some perfume or put out a diamond bracelet and try it on. It was all very, very comfortable and luxurious. And even the door handles were mermaids. Everything was thought out beautifully, the decor. And in the lobby, the artwork was the 4 seasons sculptured. So when you walked into the ship, you immediately felt a sense of luxury. And a beautiful library with wood paneling and big leather chairs that was so comfortable you'd drift into a nap in no time, and lovely lamps. And the big first-class cabins were like late Hedy Lamarr with the big mirrors. They were so Hollywood and so spacious, absolutely splendid. You can see the room here had a sitting area as well, which is like a little living room on board. And there's one of the bedrooms of the first-class suites on the ship. I don't think you could be uncomfortable on that, not question. Holland, the New Amsterdam, was designed with ingredients for the 1939 World's Fair in New York. And so she was the World's Fair ship, and she was also the ship of peace. But by 1939, 1940, war is coming to Europe. The Nazis are taking hold, and suddenly Holland America cannot sail to Holland anymore. However, they make a few quick trips, and they bring refugees to Hoboken, particularly Jewish people who are wanting to get out of Europe before the terrible times come. So many, many heartfelt, desperate moments were held on the Fifth Street Pier, and I met a lady who was one of those children. She said, "We cried when we left Europe, we cried on the ship, and we cried when we got to Hoboken because we were safe. We were away from Europe at the time." So the New Amsterdam, which was built to carry 1,200 in comfort, was now refitted to carry 9,000 soldiers during the war at one time. And so she was a big, giant troop ship. Now, the soldiers were crammed in. It was tight living. They could sleep 300 in the swimming pool with bunks. They could sleep 600 in the main lounge. The only room left untouched was the dining room. Obviously, you had to feed the soldiers. So during the war, there were 8 sessions of breakfast, 20 minutes apiece, no lunch, and 8 sessions of dinner. The soldiers came in. It's not the dinner of the peace. It's the wartime dinner with a tray. Food was put on. The soldiers ate it, and then they washed the tray, and then the cycle began all over again. So it was very tight living during the war, but Holland America played a big part in the Allied campaign against the war. And I asked one of the men I'd met who was a soldier on the New Amsterdam during the war, and I said, "What did you do during the war? What was it like?" He said, "Well, we didn't have any privacy. We told stories. We joked. We played cards. But mostly we used to watch the other guys get sick over the rail. That was our fun." So anyway, the New Amsterdam was called to great duty and sailed from Hoboken and so forth. You can see how tight sleeping was. It could be as many as 10 high, but it was wartime and people put up. The only difficulty in the war evidently was Wrigley's chewing gum. The soldiers liked to chew gum and then stick it on the ceiling of the ship, and they banned gum during the war because it was just a hazard, but they had lots of Spam and lots of Camel cigarettes. In 1944, the future Queen of Holland, Juliana, came to Hoboken to thank the crew of the New Amsterdam for all the good works that they were doing during the war. The war would be over in another year, one of many celebrities. And at the end of the war, the New Amsterdam was used to bring home the soldiers, bring home prisoners, bring home even refugees. And the Holland America ships in 1945, 46, 47 were used to bring people back in a peacetime world. Prisoners had to be returned, as I said, refugees. So they did yeoman important work. And you can see landing in Hoboken were war brides, women who had married American soldiers in Europe, then were brought to Hoboken, especially with their little babies that some of them had. And the the trips were known as the diaper run because the ships had to be outfitted for this new generation of new babies coming from Europe from soldiers. So by 1947, with the wars over by 2 years, Holland America is back in business, and Fifth Street Pier is back to the good old days of sailing to Europe, the festive sailings, people are sailing, Holland America's business is booming. To give you an example before I forget, in 1960, for a week to Europe from Hoboken was $400 in first class, $250 in second class like business on the plane, and $175 down in tourist class, and so forth. Movie stars came right and left to Hoboken to sail on Holland America, like Marlene Dietrich. And I remember my father, they'd have special police at the pier because you've had kings, queens, presidents, all sorts of people. Clark Gable sailed from Hoboken on the New Amsterdam. Deborah Carr, this is Paulette Goddard. She was a famous movie star of those bygone days. And Deborah Carr, they all sailed from Hoboken. And every year, beginning in 1959, they would have a cancer fundraising cruise on Holland America from Fifth Street. It was a one-night trip out, and it was all done to raise money for the Cancer Foundation. And ex-presidents of the United States would come, movie stars. My father said they had police cars everywhere. It was a parade of the who's who of the world coming on those ships for one night, a gala dinner, gambling to benefit cancer, and then back home the next morning. It was a one-night charity cruise, and that was part of the Holland America service. So you had, after the war, the old Veen Dam came back, and they just beginning, and they only had a canvas swimming pool, nothing like we have today, filled with salt water to cool off down in the Caribbean. And Holland America invented something new called a cruise director, a person who organized fun and activities, and that was their invention for the first time. So Holland America was an originator of many things on these liners and so forth. So business in the 50s really, really boomed. If you wanted to go a slow way to Europe, on a smaller ship, the Noordam or the Westerdam only carried 150, all first class. Every cabin had a private bathroom, which was unique. In those days, you would go down the hall sometimes for your shower and even for your toilet. That was a way of keeping the fares lower, but eventually that would change. So if you wanted to go a leisurely way, you could go 9 days on the Noordam or the Westerdam. And the Westerdam's claim to fame is in 1949, it landed at Fifth Street and unloaded the first Volkswagens in America. They were coming from Germany, and they came on the Holland America Line. And so the New Amsterdam, by 1951, Holland America realizes there's a market for cheap but very comfortable travel. So they built these two ships, the Maasdam and the Rhindam, only 39 people up top in first class, but 900 for the rest of the ship in tourist. And the tourist class not only had 90% use of the ship, they also had a swimming pool, a movie theater, a beauty salon, and a gift shop. And you could sail to Europe in 1955 for $20 a day on the Maasdam. They were a huge success. Suddenly, school teachers and secretaries and people on a budget could sail to Europe on an ocean liner for $20 a day. It was the perfect idea, and Holland America originated that as well. They eventually expanded to an around-the-world service on these ships, and which was very lovely. And by the 1960s, another invention, Holland America had the first wintertime floating university cruises where you sailed around the world for 4 months and took courses with professors, earned credits even at my age, as they called it, the University of the Seven Seas. So they were always thinking of new ideas, things. Holland America was in their offices in New York, represented all the other Dutch companies. All right, there was an occasional hiccup, like here's the Maasdam in 1954, collided with a freighter off Rhode Island and had to come back to Hoboken 12 hours later, and they said it was the shortest trip to Europe on history. But anyway, those things happen sometimes, as you can imagine. Let's see, here we go. Holland America also had what you call student ships. They were 3 of them. They were converted troop ships from the war, 900 low-fare passengers, and they were hugely popular for students who in May and June wanted to go to spend the summer in Europe and then come back in August and September. It was the Grottebeer, the Waterman, and the Zoitekruis, and they were very popular, and I still meet people who, when they were young in college, came to Hoboken to make a voyage to Europe on one of those 3 ships. It was $125. The men shared with the men, the women with the women. There were 6, 8, 10, and 12 berth rooms, and even 50 bunk dormitories. So it was a popular way from Hoboken for students to go to Europe, and thousands came. They had to even lease other ships to fill all the demand for these student trips. Holland America had a fleet of 50 freighters. So they would carry Fords and Chevys going over to Europe and American manufactured goods. Then they would come this way from Europe to Hoboken, and they'd bring gin, caraway seeds, tulips, and lots of Heineken, which was brought to the United States on Holland America. And so the piers in Hoboken were very, very busy. This is pre-container and so forth. By 1957, they introduced the Staten Dam, and now every cabin has its own shower and toilet. Things are getting more modern, and she was a beautiful ship. And by 1958, the first cruise by Holland America, luxury cruise around the world for 95 days, and they loaded 50 caskets on the ship because they knew the clients would be older and you'd probably lose a few during the voyage and so forth. So there you can see the Staten Dam and a nice view of the Fifth Street Pier back in the 50s. And you can see how busy Hoboken was. River Road, and further up at the very top, there's the shipyard where we are today, that same view. By 1959, they introduced the next ROTTERDAM, so modern it didn't even have a smokestack. It had twin uptakes, and she was the most modern ship of her time, absolutely beautiful. I remember that September day in 59. I rushed from Wallace School at 3 o'clock all the way down to Fifth Street. I wanted to see the ROTTERDAM for the first time, and she was the most modern ship of that period. And there you can see the piers with American export lines and along River Street before, of course, Marine View Towers and before other construction, and another view of the waterfront there with the little Grottebeer in the dock. And there you can see the beginning of the Port Authority piers with Holland America on the left, so forth. And there's one of the rare occasions when the ROTTERDAM and the New Amsterdam were together. They could only handle one big liner at a time, so they had to swap in the river, and the other one had to go somewhere else. So the ROTTERDAM was one of the most beloved ships of its time, and you can see beautiful Dutch decor, artwork, magnificent carpets, paintings, and so forth. Everything about it was sumptuous, a gorgeous ship. And there's one of the menus from the ship in first class at that time. There were 300 items to choose from at dinner, so forth. Every winter, the ROTTERDAM would go around the world on a luxury cruise, 95 days. And there were people like the lady who took 300 dresses for 95 days, people who traveled with trunks, people who carried jewels, a lady who took 2 suites. One was for her doll collection. She didn't want to be without it, so she took a suite just for the dolls, and they went with her on the trip. So the ROTTERDAM became a legendary world cruise ship in the winter and visited ports all over the world. So it was the big 3 for a while, but by 1958, the first jet flew to Europe. And the shipping line said, oh, flying is just a fad, it'll pass. It's a mere ripple in the road. Well, in 6 months, the airlines had 2/3 of all the business. In 5 years, 98% of people were flying. They weren't sailing by the 60s to Europe anymore. It had all changed. And so in 1963, on that March day, Holland America Line moved over to Greenwich Village in Manhattan to brand new Pier 40, where they could handle 4 ships at one time, rooftop parking. You could bring the car right up to the roof and unload your baggage. It was irresistible. And so the Fifth Street Pier was no more. However, by the 70s, Holland America was once again in deep trouble. What to do for the future? The days of sailing to Europe were over, so they had to become a cruise line where you go to places for fun. And so they began to, the chief purser was renamed the hotel director. They called the ships floating hotels. They did away with tipping, so you didn't have to reach for your wallet all the time. They made life better, and they introduced informality, Lido dining, where you could go for breakfast and lunch in your bathing suit with a restaurant attached to the pool. So you didn't have to dress up and go to the dining room. And then they expanded it at dinner time, where you could go down and have to informally not dress up in the main dining room, which appealed to a lot of people. So then by the 70s, Dutch people didn't want to sail on ships anymore. It was just not a life they wanted. So they hired Indonesians and Filipinos, and that's been a stroke of genius. So Holland America today is a huge cruise company. They are owned by Carnival. However, in the 70s, they decided to venture in a new area for trips to Alaska. And actually, it turned out to be brilliant, because the tour operator they bought became bigger than Holland America and bought the parent, so the child became the powerhouse. So Holland America became noted for their cruises to Alaska. And in 1989, they were bought by the famous Carnival Cruise Lines Corporation. So Holland America was no longer technically Dutch. It was owned by Carnival. And one thing Carnival can do is that they know how to make money. They own 10 cruise lines today, Carnival Corporation, and they control 49.5% of the entire world cruise market. And it is said, and I'll tell you this little secret, but don't tell anybody, they're going to buy the Atlantic Ocean next year and rent it to the other cruise lines. So Carnival is very successful. So they've added new ships, and Holland America today is bigger, stronger, and richer than it's ever been before. And I'm happy to say that was great. Now, a friend of mine is an artist. Brand asked me this question one time. He's an artist in Amsterdam, and he's very famous. And he loves Marlene Dietrich, who sailed from Hoboken many times and visited the ships. In his studio in Amsterdam, which I visited, he made a complete life-size model of Marlene Dietrich as if she was sailing to Europe on one of the liners. So you go into the studio and you think she's sitting there. It's so realistic. It's unbelievable. And when I was on the Rotterdam, I mentioned Hoboken as much as I could. And a lot of the Dutch crew members remembered it. They remembered when they used to come to Hoboken, the ship would arrive on Monday and sail on Saturday. So they had Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday in the week. They would work as short order cooks at Schaefer's and the town lunch. They would buy their underwear at the Wonder Shop because the quality was so good. And they would buy other things at Woolworths and Fisher Beers in Hoboken. They said Hoboken was a treat. They all loved it. It was all part of that world. And there's the old Hoboken Ferry, which I showed, because whenever I'm on ships giving lectures, I never forget our wonderful Hoboken. Thank you very, very much. Now, if you have any questions, I'd be happy. Yes. The Homeric. Yes, by then they had bought the home lines. Yes, that's correct.
And I went to Bermuda with that. So
yes.
But the food was great.
Oh yes,
They had
wonderful.
an Italian, crew for cooking.
Yes,
I
yes.
was like in heaven. So
Yes,
cheers.
Wonderful. One of the little mysteries of shipping is that there were some liners that were built in a place called Hoboken, but it's Belgium. Now, I never quite figured out, and I guess there's a little research to be done there. I don't know if that Hoboken is before our Hoboken or what, it might be, but the theory of it being an Indian name in Belgium doesn't work. So I don't know how that all pans out. Maybe somebody knows here, I don't know.
What I've always been told is that the Dutch came.
The Dutch came here.
And the Indians said Hoboken or something like it. They couldn't pronounce it, so they said Hoboken because that was the familiar name they were coming.
And maybe that city was part of Holland in those days and not Belgium.
Right.
That could be the answer. Yeah, perfect.
So the name, they took the European name, which would mimic the Indian name.
Yes.
So, the
Lenny Lenape. I'll have one last story to tell relative to Holland America. I did a lot of work for them in the 1980s, and I stayed with what was then the vice president at his home in Seattle. Holland America's headquarters is in Seattle. Of course, they're very involved with Alaska in the tour business. And I stayed with the family, and the fourth son used to come down and have coffee in the morning. So I said to him one morning, I said, "So Brendan, what do you want to be when you grow up?" He was 17 at the time. He said, He whispered, he said, "Oh, I'd like to be an actor." And I thought, "Oh, good thing I didn't say anything. I didn't see the projection. I didn't see that kind of, you know what I mean?" Well, anyway, a month later, he borrowed his mother's car and drove down the coast to Hollywood. He immediately was cast in a movie. And a few weeks ago, Brendan Fraser won the Academy Award as the best actor for The Whale. So much for my insight. I don't think he'll make it. Well, he made it pretty good, I think. Absolutely. Thank you very, very much.
Great.
Thank you.
So, no notes off the top of his head. What, do you dream this stuff?
I do. I go to bed at night. I got dressed yesterday and I hung on a hook. And I said, I've got to be ready for the museum tomorrow. So I just...
Wow. But this was a customized lecture.
Just for you. It's never been seen in the world before. And it's for my friend Bill and Bob.
Thank you so much.
Specially made. They're begging to see it in Holland, but I said, no, it's
Yeah,
big.
well, yes, and we have an audience here and we have an audience online. So,
How many do we have, Rand?
well,
Oh, it's not bad. Not
but
bad.
It'll grow.
It'll grow.
Through word of mouth, through social media, so we're really glad. And we did hear that you were celebrating a birthday this week.
May 3rd, Wednesday.
Okay. So
My mother said the shipyard whistles were blowing 10 minutes before I was born. And she said there's a symbolism there. She was in St. Mary's Hospital, and it was a particularly warm day, and they had the windows of the hospital open. And she heard the whistles as I was, how shall we say, arriving.
It's funny, I didn't connect it that way. We do have shipyard whistles in our collection. I would have brought them out.
Ah!
But we do have a birthday cake, so I'm going to light a candle and see if we can sing a birthday song together.
Thank you very much. That's very kind.
There is a ship here. I don't know if you can see it. It is not the Holland America.
Well, we'll say-
colors, but we'll say that it's a tramp steamer that came into Hoboken.
Very good.
So.
Where's Bill with the camera?
Birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Bill and Tony. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Let's eat some cake. Okay.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Did I tell you the story about the girl from the prom? One last story. When I was on the Rotterdam, the girl that I took to the Hoboken High prom 57 years ago was on the ship with her husband. I didn't recognize her at first. But anyway, it worked out. And some lady during the voyage made this for me. She's Mr. Ocean Liner. They'll be for sale soon. Yes. In the Hoboken Museum gift shop.
There you go. There you go. I'm going to put some lights on.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Rand. And thank you to the young man, too.
It's